Good evening. The Prime Minister states her intention to resign. She says another cabinet minister will stand a better chance of winning for the Conservatives. The Foreign Secretary thinks he can restore unity and he wants her job.
Just make a short statement.
The Chancellor also makes a bid. He denies it's just a tactic to stop Michael Heseltine. Neil Kinnock says he has no confidence in the government because there is no government. And tonight's other main news. 40 at least agree about one thing tonight. When this morning Mrs. Thatcher announced her intention to resign, it was an historic moment, the end of an era in British politics. Less than 24 hours after she vowed to fight on and fight to win, the Prime Minister gave way to the growing pressure within her party and agreed to withdraw from the leadership election. She made up her mind finally at 7:30 a.m. By 9 o'clock, she'd told the Cabinet she would go. Soon after, Number 10 said the Queen had been informed and a statement was issued from Mrs. Thatcher. Having consulted widely among my colleagues, it said, I have concluded that the unity of the party and the prospect of victory in a general election would be better served if I stood down to enable Cabinet colleagues to enter the ballot for the leadership. I should like to thank all those in Cabinet and outside who have given me such dedicated support. This afternoon, she was back in the Commons in an atmosphere charged with emotion, defending her government against the opposition's motion of no confidence. She'll stay on as leader and Prime Minister until her successor is chosen. By midday today, both the Foreign Secretary Douglas Hurd and the Chancellor John Major had announced that they would challenge Michael Heseltine in next week's leadership ballot. Both paid their tributes to Mrs. Thatcher, as did her friends and foes at home and abroad. The Labour leader Neil Kinnock said her decision to resign showed she amounts to more than those who have turned upon her. For the Liberal Democrats, Paddy Ashdown said despite his opposition to her policies, there is a small tinge of sadness at the end. And President Bush spoke of a staunch friend and ally. She is a woman of principle. She stood for what she believed in. In this specially extended 6 o'clock news, we'll be looking back over the Thatcher years and ahead to the campaign for the leadership. But first, with a report on the day's dramatic events, our chief political correspondent, John Sargent.
Mrs. Thatcher left Downing Street to discuss her decision with the Queen at about 12:30 this afternoon.
Good morning, Prime Minister. Prime Minister, this is a sad day. Can you come and speak live on television, Prime Minister? How are you feeling?
She was wearing a suit of the same shade of Conservative blue that she wore 11 years ago on the day she became Prime Minister. The palace had been kept fully informed of developments. Mrs. Thatcher had an audience with the Queen last night, but her decision to withdraw from the leadership contest was not taken until 7:30 this morning. Her parliamentary private secretary was the first to hear that she had decided, after all, not to fight on. The decision was taken after a long series of discussions with her closest colleagues, which went on late into the night. When the Cabinet arrived for a meeting called for 9 o'clock, the only comments came from those who were unaware of what had happened.
Are you still behind the Prime Minister, Mr. Waterbury? Yes, I am.
The entire Cabinet had said they would support her, but the majority told her they did not think she would win. Reluctantly, Mrs. Thatcher had to bow to the inevitable. Douglas Hurd was among those recommending that she should withdraw. She could not hope to hold the party together and win the next election. Inside at the Cabinet meeting, Mrs. Thatcher said it was a funny old world, that after winning 3 elections and with the overwhelming support of the party, she had to go. Some of those who had insisted it would not happen now had to eat their words.
This is a typically brave and selfless decision by the Prime Minister. Once again, Margaret Thatcher has put her country's and party's interests before personal considerations.
She has decided in the best interest of the country, the government and the party that it would best for her to stand down. And
What is her mood?
Well, her mood is, like always, she does her duty. She's, of course she's sad, but...
Mrs. Thatcher returned after half an hour at the palace. Ministers stretched the usual rules about the strict confidentiality of cabinet meetings.
A very moving statement was read out by the Lord Chancellor, followed by a statement by Douglas Hurd. I was wondering whether to come in, but quite honestly, I didn't want to prolong the agony, and no one else spoke apart from Ken Baker, who paid a great tribute to her on behalf of the party.
In the short informal gathering thereafter, as colleagues who'd soldiered together for many years together, sat over a cup of coffee reflecting on events, before we went out to resume the fight to get this party and this government back on the rails and to continue the work that we've been devoting ourselves to for so long.
At about 3 o'clock, Mrs. Thatcher left for the Commons for a most unusual session of Prime Minister's questions. When Mrs. Thatcher entered the chamber, Tory MPs stood up as a sign of respect. The general mood was friendly and understanding. Most MPs were anxious not to exploit the occasion. But the first comment from a Northern Ireland unionist was hard and double-edged.
You will understand that us, the Unionist members, will have empathy today with the Prime Minister because we know what betrayal means.
By chance, the first Tory MP to speak was one of those who'd been accused in recent days of betraying the Prime Minister.
Would my right honourable friend accept...
To his later question, the answer is no. No more than we had an election when Mr. Wilson changed to Mr. Callaghan.
The Liberal Democrat leader said that many MPs recognised that she had taken a very tough decision with great dignity.
May I also say to her that however wide our political divisions, and they are of course very wide, no one can doubt the special style she's brought to that dispatch box, nor her courage, conviction and determination that she has brought to her premiership. Mr. Speaker, perhaps I might ask her to use this opportunity to offer to the House any advice she might have for a successor.
Mr. Speaker, apart from the last bit, may I thank the right honourable gentleman for his kindness. May I remind the House that I expect to be here on Tuesday afternoon and possibly even on Thursday afternoon.
A significant reference to a possible third ballot next week.
So I hope the House will be as kind then as it is today.
Loyal Tories showed their emotion.
My right honourable friend, accept from me the love and affection of millions of people in my part of the world who have looked to her over these years with the greatest admiration and delight.
Does my right honourable friend not agree that the age of chivalry is gone and has been succeeded by those of economists and calculators? Does she further not look back with pride and satisfaction at all those years when she's leader of this country and the world's statesman?
Mrs. Thatcher readily agreed, but some MPs couldn't resist making heavy political points. A Labour MP complained of her policies, particularly the poll tax.
Will the Prime Minister indicate who she thinks should take a share in the blame for what is, after all, a Conservative mess?
Well, the honourable gentleman always was quite a good advocate. He could speak to any brief, and I don't believe he believed a word of that.
Mrs. Thatcher's performance, of course, delighted Tories and greatly impressed the majority of MPs. Even those bitterly opposed to her recognise her remarkable political personality. And on all sides, now that she's decided to go, many MPs can feel genuinely sad.
At Westminster, the three leadership campaigns have begun in earnest.
In the Commons and defending her government for the last time in a big set-piece debate. An appearance at the dispatch box described by Paddy Ashdown as a bravura performance, which I suppose makes the flowers all the more appropriate. Earlier, however, the scenes were a bit different because within hours of telling the Queen her days as Prime Minister were numbered, Mrs. Thatcher went to the House of Commons for that appearance to answer Labour's motion of no confidence in her government. She staunchly defended her 11-year term in office and predicted a fourth electoral victory for the Conservative Party. But the opposition leader, Neil Kinnock, again called for an immediate general election, saying how could there be confidence in a government split from top to bottom?
For the past few weeks...
What are their real reasons for bringing this motion before the House? Because there were no alternative policies. There were just a lot of disjointed, opaque words. It can't be complained about Britain's standing in the world. That is deservedly high, not least...
And she defended her government's stance on Europe, taking questions from opposition MPs.
Will she tell us whether she intends to continue her own personal fight against a single currency and an independent central bank when she leaves office?
No, she's going to be the governor.
On the present structure... What a good idea.
She'd warmed to her theme.
I'm enjoying this. I'm enjoying this.
But then she turned to the Gulf.
The centuries of history and experience which ensure that when principles have to be defended, when good has to be upheld, when evil has to be overcome, then Britain will take up arms. It is because we on this side have never flinched from difficult decisions that this House and this country can have confidence in this government today.
This was a confident and competent speech by Neil Kinnock, but it was dwarfed by Mrs Thatcher's tour de force. If this is her last speech as Prime Minister, then it was a vintage performance. Withering, abrasive, showing full mastery of the Commons. No one believed she'd go with a whimper, but after all she'd been through in the past 24 hours, few believed she'd go out with such a bang.
Mrs Thatcher's decision has produced a mixture of emotions amongst Conservative MPs. Many were visibly shocked when the news broke this morning. Some long-serving Conservative backbenchers were clearly angry at Mr Heseltine's stand against her. Others mourned the end of an era, and some paid tribute to the woman who'd led them for their entire political career.
As senior Tories made their way to a memorial service at the Abbey, MPs tried to digest the news of Margaret Thatcher's political demise. Relief was one dominant emotion.
But a very sad end to one of the outstanding premierships of the post-war period. Now we've got another week of deciding who is going to succeed Mrs Thatcher. It won't be easy for any of us, but just for the moment I think we're all feeling a sense of shock and a sense of identity with how she must be feeling herself.
We're all sad, but it's the right decision, because she's gone in a noble way instead of being ignobly beaten, which would have been terrible.
Some 12 million people, that a few members of our party have actually brought the Prime Minister down.
How will the world see it, do you think?
I think they will be amazed, absolutely amazed.
The rancour of the Thatcher loyalists is aimed not at those who convinced the Prime Minister to go, but at the Heseltine bandwagon that made her departure almost inevitable.
They're cowards. They did it because they were trying to save their seats. And they hid behind, most of them, behind the cloak of anonymity. And the effect has been that someone who has been elected 3 times by 30 million people has been turfed out by 150.
I've had these letters saying, you know, if you ditch Margaret Thatcher, we'll never work for the Conservative Party again. To which I respond, stay with us. The real enemy is socialism, and at the end of this process we'll have a leader who will send Neil Kinnock packing at the next election.
So once again, MPs are asking each other, who are you voting for?
Well, I have had a deep struggle between Mr Major and Mr Hurd. It hasn't been an easy choice. I think either would make an excellent Prime Minister, either would unite the party, but I have decided that on grounds of experience and the authority he carries in the House and the very fine showing that he's made in foreign affairs, bearing in mind the Gulf crisis is coming up, that I feel I must support Douglas Hurd.
I think Michael must be the favourite now. He's up and running.
It was pushed. There was a very strong effort on Mrs Thatcher's behalf, starting mid-afternoon. As soon as she got back from Paris, her managers went into action, the right wing of the party, and other people who are enthusiastic for Mrs Thatcher went in, and there was a big campaign, a counter-attack rolling. But then, as she saw the ministers in the course of the evening, as she saw other advisers, it became clear that an awful lot of them were only supporting her with the greatest possible reluctance. A whole group of cabinet ministers, I think about 4 or 5, told her that they couldn't speak up for her during the weekend if she tried to start
stand for a second ballot. Those included people, I think, like Chris Patton, Kenneth Clark, Malcolm Rifkind, Norman Lamont. And there were others who, although they did not say that, made it very clear to her that they felt she would be much wiser for her own sake and for the sake of the party to stand down. So she went home to Downing Street. She had a late night session with Norman Tebbit, among others, and she said she would sleep on it, but I think most of them thought that her mind was made up before she went to bed.
Now, we've just heard John Major say that he wouldn't have entered if he thought he couldn't win. But is there, in effect, a little cabal between him and Douglas Hurd? Have they got any sort of arrangement to stop Michael Heseltine?
Well, I don't think it's a cabal, but I think it is quite clear that Michael Heseltine, in racing parlance, is both the favourite and the outsider. That may seem a paradox, but he's the favourite because of the number of votes he accumulated against Mrs. Thatcher, and because it was he who gave the anti-Thatcher bandwagon its push, though that may itself produce its reaction. He's the outsider because the cabinet...
The Foreign Secretary, Douglas Hurd, and the Chancellor of the...
You know, I'm certain that this will continue with the United Kingdom, but on a personal basis, I'll miss her because I value her counsel. I value her long experience, the wisdom that comes from her long experience, and she has been an outstanding Prime Minister for the United Kingdom and an outstanding friend of the United States.
British troops had been invited to meet the President. They too were digesting the news along with traditional turkey dinner. Military plans were unlikely to be altered.
From Europe, President Mitterrand of France has written to her saying she'd marked an important period in the history of her country and of Europe. And the President of the European Commission, Jacques Delors, expressed a feeling of immense regard and esteem for her, despite their past differences. The Iraqis, however, are glad to see her go. And spokesman for President Saddam Hussein said she'd been buried by the Gulf crisis.
Well, back now to Mrs. Thatcher's decision to resign. Joining us from Westminster is the Foreign Secretary and now leadership contender, Douglas Hurd.
People around Britain have been giving their verdict on her time in office.
3 words summed it up, and there was really nothing else that people wanted to talk about. At Buckingham Palace, the crowds that had gathered for the changing of the guard suddenly found that they were in a prime position to witness a piece of history. The mood was one of shock, but most felt that Mrs. Thatcher's decision had been the right one.
I don't think she was in with a fair chance from now on. I don't think she'd ever have the same credibility.
She had got herself into the position where she believed that she was right to the extent that she wasn't prepared to take advice from her ministers.
It's a real end of an era, but it's been such an awful era for the country that I don't think she'll be mourned by too many people.
At Mrs. Thatcher's old school in Grantham, no one could quite believe that their most famous pupil was no longer to be the leader of the country.
We look up to her and we just see her as this great role model and gives us an inspiration.
She's a woman who succeeded in a male-dominated world. I don't think that she will lose any standing.
At her constituency headquarters at Finchley in North London, party workers were fiercely loyal.
People have been grumbling for a long time. It's very, very easy to grumble. It's going to be a very different situation now, and I think the whole world is going to miss her enormously.
The sense that an era was over was reflected in different ways throughout the country, and there were mixed views about the Prime Minister's demise.
It's through the poll tax, and it's people like in Liverpool who've got rid of Thatcher, and I'd just like to thank all of them for not paying the poll tax.
I like Mrs. Thatcher. I thought she did a very good job, but I also think that it is time for a change now.
I think it's a very good idea. I really honestly think it's time we had somebody new and fresh in the cabinet.
Delighted.
I'm very, very sorry about it, but I think she's done a wise thing.
Meanwhile, the man who's been at his wife's side throughout her leadership had lunch with a friend at the Savoy. His only comment on the day's momentous events were perhaps characteristically down to earth. Well, he said, these things happen.
Mrs. Thatcher has led the Conservative Party since 1975, when she unexpectedly took the leadership from the former Prime Minister, Edward Heath. Our chief political correspondent, John Sargent, looks back on the Thatcher years.
Hand's been up for ages. Roger.
Would you like to see a woman Prime Minister?
I think it depends upon who the person is. I don't think that there will be a woman Prime Minister in my lifetime.
It did seem impossible even for a young Secretary of State for Education who'd already shown a surprising degree of determination and no shortage of ambition. From now on would be added the vital ingredient of luck in timing and opportunity. Mrs. Thatcher benefited by Mr. Heath's misfortune, the 3-day week, the failed attempt to resolve the challenge from the miners with an election called on the basis of who governs Britain. Mrs. Thatcher was the only former member of the cabinet who was prepared to challenge Mr. Heath in the first round of the subsequent leadership election. "I've got my teeth into him," she told a friend, "and I'm not going to let go." Mr. Heath was humiliated. Before the second ballot, Mrs. Thatcher opened an attack on the consensus politics of both Conservative and Labour governments which had dominated British politics for a generation.
We should back the workers and not the shirkers.
Mrs. Thatcher's victory was a triumph for the right wing of the Conservative Party. Lord Whitelaw and others came in too late to stop her. But at this stage, the selling point was not ideology, but novelty. A real live woman leader campaigning for a party. The seeds of real political change, though, were being planted, as the already weakened Labour government were mortally wounded by the winter of discontent. These images helped to make up for Mrs. Thatcher's inexperience when she came to fight her first general election. And the importance of what at this time became known as the media she quickly accepted. Using it after her victory, she even managed to make famous a medieval prayer.
Where there is discord, may we bring harmony. Where there is error, may we bring truth. Where there is doubt, may we bring faith. And where there is despair, may we bring hope.
But it soon became apparent that Mrs. Thatcher wasn't prepared to consolidate her victory by compromise. Her policy wasn't yet called Thatcherism. She preferred to describe it as good housekeeping. Unemployment might be rising, along with the Tories' unpopularity, but public spending had to be reined in. Inflation could only be beaten by making sure the government didn't print money. Opponents called it the monetarist experiment. Those ministers who objected were described as wets. Mrs. Thatcher would not turn.
To those waiting with bated breath for that favourite media catchphrase, the U-turn, I have only one thing to say. You turn if you want to. The ladies not for turning.
The budget of 1981, proposing an even tighter squeeze despite the recession, left the wets dumbfounded. But inflation was reduced and the economy began to pick up. And then came the Falklands War. The invasion of the Falklands was seen as a failure of government. 3 ministers resigned. But Mrs. Thatcher took the hardest decision of her career and dispatched the task force, despite the considerable military risks. And she displayed the tension she felt when the news came through that South Georgia had been retaken.
Just rejoice at that news and congratulate our forces and the Marines.
Are we going to declare war on Mrs. Thatcher?
Rejoice.
There were terrible moments when it looked as if the risks of the Falklands War might be too great. But it left Mrs. Thatcher clearly strengthened. The Falklands factor helped her to win the election the year after. But also the economy had picked up, and with the sale of council houses, Mrs. Thatcher had widened her appeal. Labour looked old-fashioned, and with the birth of the Centre Party alliance, the opposition was fatally divided. It was her landslide. For 4 years, Mrs. Thatcher would be able to press ahead with the domestic policies of which she would be most proud. Above all, privatisation, gas and British Telecom, the first of the changes which would produce an historic shift from public to private ownership. From now on, it wouldn't only be the Tory right who would praise the workings of the market. In 1984, Mrs. Thatcher faced her severest personal test. 7 people died in the Brighton bomb, and the Prime Minister showed her strength and courage.
I was up working. The bomb went off somewhere between 2:45 and 3. I know that because I looked up when I'd finished something at 2:45.
and I just turned to do one final paper, and then it went off. My husband was in bed, and all the windows went, and the bathroom was extremely badly
In
damaged.
your own room?
Yes, yes.
I think that's enough, Prime Minister.
We were very lucky.
During the whole of her time in office, the Northern Ireland problem and the IRA threat would be a constant concern. Her most significant initiative, the Anglo-Irish Agreement, was signed in 1985. But it didn't, as hoped, lead to a reduction in terrorism. In the same year, the miners' dispute was finally resolved. Mrs. Thatcher had been determined not to give in. She considered that the Union leader, Arthur Scargill, and the striking miners were the enemy within. Having seen off the Argentine leader Galtieri, wasn't he next in line? And it fitted in with her general determination to press ahead with her trade union reforms. Mrs. Thatcher won the victory many people hoped for, but the cost was considerable. And some criticised what they saw as her apparent enthusiasm for confrontation. That criticism of her style was raised again when she attended a Commonwealth conference. She agreed to sanctions against South Africa involving a ban on Krugerrands, but then went out of her way to play down its importance.
Tiny little bit, tiny little bit, tiny. Do you know how the value of Krugerrands that are imported? £500,000.
Different questions about her style were raised by the Westland affair. An argument over the future of the helicopter company turned personal. Michael Heseltine left, complaining that Mrs. Thatcher was undermining cabinet government. Another cabinet minister, Leon Britton, was engulfed, and differences on European policy emerged. Mrs. Thatcher always seemed to be happier looking across the Atlantic than across the Channel. She formed a close personal link with Ronald Reagan, and readily agreed when he wanted British bases for the Libyan bombing raid. The leader of the other superpower also found Mrs. Thatcher a useful ally. By laying on a spectacular visit to Moscow, President Gorbachev confirmed her position as a major international figure. And at home, helped by a chancellor she was to call brilliant, the economy boomed. Income tax, particularly on the top rates, was cut. Yuppies emerged. High growth and low inflation at last seemed possible. The 1987 election marked the high point of what Tories were now happy to call Thatcherism. Mrs. Thatcher had changed the political map, and Labour could not deny it.
We've got a big job to do in some of those inner cities, a really big job. Our policies were geared education and housing to help the people in the inner cities to get more choice. And politically, we must get right back in there because we want them to next time. But you've been...
Emboldened by her victory, Mrs. Thatcher pressed on. More privatisations and more radical changes in education and health. Replacing domestic rates with the poll tax was to be the flagship of her new legislation. Some leading Tories were among those who thought it was more like the Titanic, which could bring them all down. And on the issue which always risked splitting the party, Europe, Mrs. Thatcher seemed determined to make a stand.
We have not successfully rolled back the frontiers of the state in Britain, only to see them reimposed at a European level, with a European superstate exercising a new dominance from Brussels.
When the campaign opened for elections to the European Parliament, Mrs. Thatcher argued on her record of standing up for British interests. Hadn't she, in the great row over the European budget, got our money back? But politics at the European level were changing fast. At the Madrid summit, Sir Geoffrey Howe had succeeded with Nigel Lawson in convincing the Prime Minister of the need to join the exchange rate mechanism. But Mr. Lawson and later Sir Geoffrey would both resign because they believed Mrs. Thatcher was wrong over Europe. And when Nicholas Ridley was too frank in public on the subject, he had to go, even though on this issue he was Mrs. Thatcher's closest cabinet ally. In the meantime, the new Chancellor, John Major, was having to grapple with a faltering economy. Inflation and interest rates were up, and Labour had a stubborn lead in the opinion polls. It looked as if Mrs. Thatcher's luck was at last running out. Tories were fearful that Neil Kinnock and his new-look Labour Party would beat them at the next election. It was the prospect of electoral defeat which above all would undermine Mrs. Thatcher's leadership. How history will judge Mrs. Thatcher compared with other Prime Ministers can only be guessed. Certainly no other Prime Minister this century has served as long. She may be remembered as much for her personality as her politics. The first woman leader delighting in leading from the front. To her supporters, the steadfast defender of British interests. It's been the variety of roles she's been prepared to play which also marks her out, and her ability to transform complicated issues, such as improving the environment, into practical examples. She may sometimes have invited ridicule, but her views have always been serious, and she's got them across. As the first Prime Minister to be seen facing the Commons on television, she's had to adapt to a wider political audience, and she's often been able to give a convincing impression of enjoying the ordeal.
But in fact, the Education Secretary backed me.
But for her critics, her true legacy lies outside Westminster. For a time, this area represented the parts of Britain that Thatcherism didn't reach, and there are many who see Mrs. Thatcher as an isolated figure who always lacked compassion. Some of her colleagues were hoping that, like Queen Elizabeth I, she would preside over a golden age. Instead, they and the country have had to settle for something rather less.
The Thatcher years, which she herself decided today, were over. From Anna Ford and from me, good evening.